Welcome. I'm Peter Curti, a research scholar at the CIS, and it's a great pleasure to have your company for an important conversation about human rights, both in Australia and around the world. Australia has always shown a strong commitment to protecting human rights. We are signatories to key international instruments defining important rights. And since its establishment in 1986, the Australian Human Rights Commission has been an advocate for the human rights of all Australians. And yet restrictions imposed by state and federal governments over the last 2 years during the COVID-19 pandemic showed how quickly freedoms we take for granted can be removed or debased, with few apparent murmurs of dissent. At the same time, the ideology of identity politics continues to tighten its grip on our society, in schools, universities, and in boardrooms. Those deemed to have offended are threatened with the sanction of cancellation and vilification. And now, with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the continent of Europe is confronted by perhaps the most serious violation of national sovereignty since 1945. In all this, we see how easily claims to the exercise of fundamental human rights to liberty, to freedom of speech, freedom of conscience, and freedom of religion can be weakened. Well, I'm delighted to be joined by Lorraine Finlay, Australian Human Rights Commissioner, and the Honourable Tim Wilson MP, a former Human Rights Commissioner himself and currently serving as the federal member for Goldstein in Victoria. Lorraine and Tim, a very warm welcome to you both.
Good evening. Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Peter, for having us.
Well, Lorraine, let me begin with you by asking a very basic question. What are human rights and why do we have them?
Well, it's a really basic question, but is actually a lot more complicated in practice. So human rights are something that are inherent in all of us by virtue of the fact that we're human. And they're the minimum things that we need to be able to flourish as human beings and live our lives in a full way. So to my mind, they're incredibly important because they're not just a theoretical construct that's written down in a document somewhere in Geneva, but they're actually things that play out in the way we live our day-to-day lives. And certainly in the introduction, you mentioned that in Australia in recent years, we've had some very real examples of the tangible reasons that human rights matter.
You took up your role as a at the Human Rights Commission at a time when many people were expressing grave concerns about the impact on individual liberty of all those restrictions that I mentioned that were imposed by government, enforced by what at times was rather heavy-handed policing. How robust do you think protections for human rights are in Australia?
Well, I think human rights are robustly protected in Australia because we have a population who care about human rights. And at the end of the day, there are a variety of institutions in Australia that are designed to protect and strengthen human rights. But, at the end of the day, when it comes down to it, it actually is down to the citizens of a country to make sure that rights are something they care about, rights are something they protect, and rights are something that they're willing to stand up for.
Tim, you've been a commissioner, as I said in the intro, and now you're a parliamentarian. How do you respond to criticism that in the past couple of years, parliamentary scrutiny of the invasion or erosion of individual liberty by public health orders and by police tactics have been inadequate?
Well, Peter, I'm going to be a bit contrarian. I actually disagree with a lot of what Lorraine said before, I should call it the commissioner. Having been in those roles in the past, we pay proper deference to those who have them. I'm going to be a bit contrarian and say, actually, I don't know that Australians do actually care as much about human rights as we think they do. And I say that as someone who's kind of been on a journey of understanding Australians' approach to human rights, having served in that office previously. Where when I went in, I was passionate and still am very passionate about fundamental freedoms of how Australians live out their lives. And because to me, human rights aren't just really a discussion about political ideology, though that's very important. One of the things that I think Lorraine will have to get used to is people saying, human rights should be above politics. And I always used to politely respond to people, well, apart from being political ideas about political values advanced through political ideologies and political philosophers, through political instruments, they're not political at all. They're deeply, deeply political. The radical idea that all people are born equal is still a very radical notion in large parts of the world. So they are political. And in fact, in Australia, we've had opportunities to kind of put stakes in the ground for human rights and have largely chosen not to, relying on the more informal conversations that sit in the common law through our inheritance from English law. And so I think that's where it's sat in the conversation. We like the rhetoric of rights, but often practically, we don't take as strong a view as we think we may instinctively do. And so the way I look at the past couple of years is to say that's been the maturation of the consequence of when you don't have hard human rights instruments in domestic law, is that in response to events that sometimes need a more central objective or central common objective for the body politic, and the survival of the nation itself, people have been prepared to forego them. There have been elements of scrutiny, but even in the states where there have been supposed human rights instruments, including the great state of Victoria, which I'm in right now, some of them had the weakest oversight of violations of rights, whether it was locking people up in public housing towers, or, of course, locking people in their homes for very long periods of time. In fact, one of the issues I had with the Commissioner's predecessor was in a public hearing. We were talking about some of the tensions between lockdowns and the consequences to rights and liberties, and whether people were even prepared to call it out. And a lot of the times, even the human rights bodies believed that there was a necessity to call them out.
So it sounds as though you were not surprised that there was so little dissent. I mean, there was noisy dissent in some sectors, but it sounds as though you're not surprised that more people didn't say as much as they might have done.
No, I wasn't surprised, certainly not at the start. And even as somebody who's very strong on human rights, I mean, basically, if people can't live, of course, then they don't have rights anymore. So, and particularly against an unknown threat, there's always been a sacrifice in times of crisis of rights, in part to address the survival of the nation. Of course, the normal example is war. And certainly in the beginning of the pandemic, it really was an invisible war, because we neither knew the enemy nor we knew how far it was or the impact it was going to have. And so we took measures which would ordinarily seem extremely disproportionate, closing international borders, putting people in lockdowns. The question is whether that dynamic or the proportionality changed over time. And I think for a lot of people over time, when they saw the costs and the benefits, and whether it was necessary to protect the nation, people started to question that and reassert their freedom. And that became bigger, again, particularly in Victoria, but also in other states over time, where Australians are much more robust in questioning the basis of government decision-making when it encroaches on people's liberty related to COVID-19.
Lorraine,
because there are
please do.
That Tim said that are really, really interesting and worthy of further exploration. And, one of the first was, the acknowledgement that in relation to COVID, I think it's a really good example of the fact that rights don't exist in isolation. That when you talk about my human rights, you need to recognise that it's always going to impact upon other people's human rights. And that's the real challenge in the pandemic environment, to find that balance between protecting the right to public health and, protecting other fundamental human rights. But the really interesting thing I think Tim touched on earlier was this idea of robust laws to protect rights and, putting down those fence posts to protect rights. And, one of the things that our common law heritage does is it actually puts down robust parliamentary oversight as a key protector of rights. So it's not just looking at, do we have a particular law or a charter or a particular piece of paper that protects them, but do we have those democratic mechanisms that we can engage in that actually provide for rights oversight and accountability? And I think that's been one of the interesting realizations to me during the pandemic, just how easily those different powers exercised by different spheres of government have changed. And that balance, I think, between the legislature and the executive has really shifted in a way that has profound impacts for rights in Australia.
Well, the British jurist Jonathan Sumption has remarked that societies generally lose their liberty because it's voluntarily surrendered by fear of some external threat, prompting people to conform to authoritarian degrees. How do you think governments can now dispel the fear of contagion and restore faith in liberty?
Well, I mean, I think we've found obviously a better balance as a consequence of seeming to have overcome at this point, and I don't want to declare victory too early over COVID, but I think in the end it needs to more than anything else sit in the body politic and their hearts and minds. And one of the reasons why I'm a human rights guy at heart is because all politics is about power, who has it, and the extent to which they can exercise it and for what purpose. And the point of rights is to say, well, the individual has been, and the organic institutions of society as they freely participate are a bulwark against centralized authority. And what we've seen over the pandemic is and this is what Lorraine said before, a very big shift, not just to law, but even transcending that into executive power, of which of course, I'm part of an executive across the country. And I think it's about citizens taking that sense of responsibility back and recognising that there are trade-offs with that as part of a mature conversation against the removal of that threat. But it really does come down to citizens. But one of the challenges with that conversation is that it also needs to recognise not just the conversation around rights, but also matters like responsibilities and, of course, recognising the idea of the harm principle. And I get this often when people raise with me the idea of rights in the context of things like the vaccines and vaccine mandates and how far they should extend. And I don't want to get into a long conversation about it, but often they talk about it only narrowly within the context of rights, rather than actually having a full appreciation of what their responsibility is to not just themselves, but also towards others, but also, of course, the harm principle that can be inflicted if people choose not to protect themselves and that they become a willing or high likelihood of a spreader of a virus that can harm others. So I actually think it's a really interesting time to have this kind of dialogue, because it's about socializing the ideas that sit at the heart of the body politic. And if people wish to take back their rights, they must also take back their sense of responsibility and duty, which is the foundation, I think, of ultimately of a successful nation and one in the liberal democratic spirit. But it must sit in the body politic and in the citizen.
Lorraine, how do you respond to that?
So in the sense that you can't talk about rights without responsibilities, because your responsibilities is really about recognising that the rights of others are as important as your own individual rights. But I think this goes back to what you were saying right at the start about where do rights come from and why are they important? Because I think it is really important to recognise that rights are inherent. They're not the gift of government. If they're the gift of government, then what government gives, government can take away. Rights are something that are inherent in all of us by virtue of the fact that we're human. And that's a really important starting principle. So while we can have a discussion about when we should restrict rights because we respect the rights of others, how it works in practice, how we find that balance, it always needs to start from the position that these aren't gifts from government. These are things that are ours because of the fact that we are human beings. And that's actually a really radical idea in the history of humankind, but something that is, really fundamentally important. And I think it is a particularly important thing when we're talking about pandemic laws and emergency responses, because it is important to recognise that while there are things that we allow to be restricted during an emergency, ensuring that there isn't that creeping normalisation of those restrictions is actually really significant.
Well, let me ask you this, Lorraine, as a newly appointed or recently appointed commissioner, what contribution does the Australian Human Rights Commission make in that sense to strengthening human rights in Australia?
Well, there are a number of different avenues. I mean, the first thing is we're not the government. So we're not politicians. We don't take a political view. We sit above politics. But I think we have an important role in shining a light on issues through our inquiry mechanisms and investigative mechanisms. We have an important role in education and talking about rights and strengthening that conversation. And then separate to the individual commissioners, there's also an important complaints function that the Human Rights Commission has that is directed through the President.
Tim, the way we think about human rights today has been largely defined by those key international instruments to which Australia is a signatory, such as the 1948 Universal Declaration and the 1966 International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. But increasingly, so-called protection rights, which kept the state out of the lives of citizens, such as freedom of speech and religion and association, have given way to economic rights granted by the state to individuals, such as the right to social security security. How worried should we be by what some critics call this debasement of human rights?
Now, I was going to say, in the context of, what we traditionally call negative and positive liberty, of, negative liberty about restrictions on people's capacity to be able to live out their lives versus positive liberty, what government gives to people. Yes, there has been a greying of the conversation between them. And, I'm more of a negative liberties guy because I believe in those fundamental freedoms around people's right to freedom of speech, freedom of association, freedom of religion, etc. But the truth is, if you're talking about achieving public policy objectives, constantly bringing in conversations around rights as the basis for things like economic and social rights, a lot of the people who make those arguments think they're kind of like a drop mic moment. I have a right to housing, or I have a right to health because this UN treaty says, or instrument says I do. The reality is that is the least persuasive political argument you can make in a liberal democracy, particularly one like Australia with our culture. So if you're interested in the theory of rights, it's you should be very worried, I think, about the pollution of the discussion around rights, where it's around positive rights, because, of course, the rights then continue to expand. So we see this more and more where people use environmental rights as a justification to encroach on liberties and things like property rights and the like. But in practice, the country just doesn't work like that, because people don't find them a persuasive argument, because in the end, they don't take account of rights coupled with responsibilities, and also recognising the rights and freedoms of others. So I don't think it's, while it's intellectually very challenging, I don't believe that ultimately, politically, it's a very effective mechanism to try and change the dialogue or the conversation.
Except we do hear increasingly demands that governments at whatever level meets a requirement that the state provide a right to, or meet its obligation to satisfy the right, say, to housing. So whilst you make the case against that, it's increasingly part of the public discourse that people are saying, I have a right to this and I want that right to be satisfied.
Well, I'm not arguing that. I'm saying I think when people make that argument, they think they can sort of make the argument, it's a drop mic moment, and all of a sudden nobody can argue with them. In practice, I find it's a very ineffective argument, because it's not persuasive. It's asserting something without making the case for why it's the best outcome, or why other people should be responsible for providing it to people. Because, and I go back to that point around power, all politics is about power. The strength of our democracy and the strength of our society is that we are constantly, or we have traditionally constantly tried to find ways to decentralize as much power. So you need to persuade the public as much as possible, if people are to forego certain things, that there's a justification for being able to do so. And I think that sits at the heart of our political tradition, and therefore just asserting a concept of rights for people as a justification why they have to give up more money from their taxes or whatever it is, doesn't ultimately persuade people very effectively.
Lorraine, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, if I could add into that, what I think is the real key there is the difference between the theory of rights and the practice. Because at a theoretical level, having a positive conception of rights that expands upon or adds to the sort of traditional civil and political rights really leads to a more fulsome conversation about what the totality of rights should be. But in a practical sense, when you look at, for example, a right to housing or a right to health or a right to education in a siloed way, you lose sight of the fact that there are limited resources, and that the fulsome realisation of one right will necessarily divert resources from realising another right. So it really is about looking at how this works in practice. And that's the hard thing about human rights. It's very easy to put your hand up and say, I believe in this right wholeheartedly. It's another thing to start talking about, well, how far does that extend in practice, and what are the payoffs that we're prepared to accept in order to realise that right, and how does it work when it conflicts with another right and we have to make some really hard decisions about accommodating the different rights of people in society. Rights are really easy to believe in wholeheartedly in theory. It's much harder in practice to actually deliver a reasonable accommodation that allows everybody to have the fullest realisation of their rights as possible. And I think Tim's also right in terms of saying simply declaring something as a human right shouldn't be an excuse to then not have to go further and justify why that's important and why that should be a priority and how that sits with the rights that other people have. So it's not a mic drop moment, or it shouldn't be. It should be the start of a broader conversation.
And I think that's a really interesting point, because we're seeing, I think, rights like freedom of speech now being spoken of as if they are one of those drop moments that you and Tim have referred to, because that seems to be in danger of becoming another inverted human right. Concern for protecting the vulnerable, especially on campus, seems to have inhibited the free expression of ideas. How adequate do you think protections for free speech are? To what extent is the right to freedom of speech, which of course is traditionally seen as a shield right, to what extent is that becoming a demand right? And how do we prevent the assertion of those rights becoming in turn an obstacle to liberty?
Well, the truth is, I think it actually comes down to leadership, Peter. And this is one of the most frustrating things, is that in society today, too many people would rather be popular than do what they think is right. Most people, in principle, agree with the principle of freedom of speech and believing in the rights and freedoms of others, but often go weak at the knees in defending it. And tertiary institutions are obviously one of the ones that are easiest to persuade, because people will make the case for disharmony if the veil of censorship isn't applied. So I think a lot of it comes down to leadership and whether we're prepared to stand up, not just as a citizenry, but actually for the people who are put in positions of responsibility, to say, if you want a society that's truly diverse, because everybody talks about how they want diversity, but as that old joke goes, what's the opposite of diversity? University. I once wrote that in an article, and I think I got a little bit of trouble as Human Rights Commissioner, but it was nonetheless poignant. Is that too often there are just people who go weak at the knees in having this conversation, because it means challenging authority. And the whole point of rights is actually to empower people to challenge authority and to be able to, on my wall here, which you can't see, but is an old Norman Rockwell poster from the Second World War that was in the context of the four freedoms and what was being extolled at the time of why we had to defend free speech. And it's of a man who's standing up in a community town hall and is clearly about to say something perhaps not as considered as intellectuals want, perhaps not as popular as some other people would want, but nonetheless that people have a right to be able to stand up and express it, at least because the pathway of human progress is paved by ideas being put out and being challenged and actually being defeated when they might be proven to be wrong or might be found to be come short. And that's what we're ultimately selling out when we try and diminish free speech in society, is actually human progress. And I find that very distressing, but it's not just in the space of universities. It's in all part of our body politic. But it requires people to be prepared to stand up for the principle, even when people are saying things that cross the line of social acceptability. And I think that goes to a broader issue around political courage, well, not just political courage, but courage in our society, and the fact that people need to find that inner courage to stand up for the type of nation we want to be.
Lorraine?
Well, can I just say, first of all, I thought I was the only person that had the Norman Rockwell Four Freedoms up on my wall at home. So I'm glad that I'm not the only one. And I think Tim's right in the sense that if all that freedom of speech means is that nice people can say nice things that everybody agrees with, then it's actually a freedom that doesn't mean very much at all. But I think the really difficult thing about freedom of speech that, as human beings, we like having things being certain. We like there being clear lines. We like there being a right and a wrong. One of the really hard things about rights like freedom of speech is reasonable people can disagree about where the boundaries should be drawn. And I think that's something that we lose sight of sometimes, that we don't all have to disagree precisely on this. We can have a discussion about where the line should be. And in terms of freedom of speech, again, everybody agrees with freedom of speech in principle. In practice, it's much harder because it not only requires you to figure out where those boundaries are, but it also requires you to defend statements that you yourself might find completely wrong and objectionable, but the principle of freedom of speech is important enough that you need to understand it shouldn't just be about nice people saying nice things that you wholeheartedly agree with.
We've seen this played out, I think, in a very interesting way in recent weeks with the fate of the government's religious discrimination bill, which founded for a variety of reasons. And I don't want to get into the politics of the bill, but how did it get to the point in a multicultural society like Australia that we ever came to need a law to protect religious freedom? Because it seems to me, I have a particular interest in religious freedom, that involves the assertion of or the making of statements or the assertion of positions that are bound to offend others. And yet we seem to have reached the point where, I mean, Tim used the word courage, which I think is a very important word to use in rights discourse. We seem to have reached a point where we lack the courage to be able to live with true diversity in our society and to live with differences of opinion that can be tough. What is the future, do you think, of freedoms like that and human rights, such as the right to religious liberty, given the fate of the bill?
Well, could I jump in with sort of a preliminary point before going to the bill and the discussion around religious freedom? I think it's a point that is more generally applicable, and it's one of the things that's concerned me about the tenor of human rights discussions in Australia, not just in relation to religious freedom, but that's certainly a good example, is that the discussion seems to focus on division. So we seem to be pitting one group against another and dividing ourselves into tribes rather than actually focusing on the fact that these should be unifying ideas. You know, the fact that we might not all agree in terms of what our particular view of faith is, but surely we can all agree on the fact that in and of itself, having the freedom to express your religious faith is a positive thing. And surely we can find a way to find common ground to ensure that that's done in a way that doesn't impact the rights of others in an unacceptable way. So I think one of the frustrations I have around the debate is, you know, the foundation of human rights is the idea that we're all equal in dignity, and that should be a really unifying concept. But at the moment, it seems to be taking place in a very divided, politicised way, which I think is concerning.
That's fundamentally the point. I mean, the point of human rights is that they're not selective. They go to the heart of our common humanity as a people. So freedom of religion is, of course, people's freedom of conscience at heart. And it doesn't actually much matter what your conscience is or what motivates it. Everybody has it. In fact, it's one of the few rights that everybody sort of agrees is actually unlimited, the freedom to think for yourself. And then, of course, how you seek to manifest it or practice it, needs to be done in a lawful way in lots of different ways. And we can get into a conversation about that. And so, but to be honest, I think the challenge that sets some of this conversation didn't originate in a recent debate around the religious discrimination bill. It set back, and there's a long pedigree that sits back where religious organisations haven't respected the rights and freedoms of other people to be able to live out the full component of their life. And of course, you know, that a lot of these discussions happen in the context of gays v. God. I don't really like that framing, but the reality is there's been a long discussion about religion and people's, you know, sexual behaviour and how that's then translated into bodies of law and the like. And the only way you're going to get to a sustainable way where everybody's rights and freedoms are respected in the true sense of diversity, because of course, even within religious practice, there is of course a lot of diversity, is if we start from that basic principle that Lorraine outlined, which is around people's common humanity. And that must then extend to people who sit outside of faith and not just for the purpose of their faith, because of course, freedom of religion includes atheism and agnosticism as well, but also of course, how other people choose to live their life, and to create a society that actually encourages people to live out the fullness of their freedom in all of their life. I used to have this argument with a judge when I was in Lorraine's position, who used to say freedom of religion ends at the end of the chapel door or the church door. And I said, well, that's as absurd as saying people's sexual orientation ends at the bedroom door. It doesn't. These things inform the fullness of our lives. It's a question of how you civilise people's conduct on the basis of respect. And a lot of that, frankly, isn't best dealt with through law. It's just not. It's through the civilization that occurs by encouraging people to come together to create a society anchored in tolerance. And I say tolerance very deliberately, not the word of acceptance, because the reality is people won't always accept each other's conduct or the motivations behind their conduct, but we can learn to respect and tolerate tolerate each other based on our common humanity, and really to bring people together, because Lorraine's 100% right. Once you divide people into camps of whatever motivation, and again, there's a long tradition of this in religion as well, the more you're going to end up in a position of conflict if people want to use law to impose their worldview on the rest of the community.
Law isn't the best answer in all cases or the only answer. And I think that's something we've lost a little bit in the discussion around the religious discrimination bill. I think there is a very important role to play for the law. I think we do need to make sure our laws are appropriately strengthened and that they reflect an appropriate balance. But I also think this idea that the default position of we think there might be an issue here, let's bring in a law, it isn't always the best approach. And what it actually does, again, is it removes our responsibility that we all share for actually making sure that these values are things that we live in our day-to-day lives, and that respect for each other's rights is something that we live in our day-to-day lives, not because the law tells us we have to, but because we know that it's the right thing to do. So I think that common humanity and the idea of all of us having responsibility for ensuring that we have a rights-focused society is something that we can't just outsource to government. It's much too important for that.
And that's an important point, because I think that it picks up points that each of you has made, both of you have made about the political context of rights and indeed the cultural context within which rights are exercised. Because if there is a move on one side to encroach upon another point of view, eventually there'll be a pushback, and we end up in a sort of an ideological and cultural tussle. And I'm sure that's right, that what we need to do is not become dependent upon law, but actually accept the fact that each of us has a responsibility to respect and tolerate. I mean, because I think that's an important point that Tim made, that tolerance is not just respect, and it certainly doesn't mean indifference. It actually means putting up with something that you don't agree with, that you don't like, but that you recognise a point of view, for example, that somebody is entitled to hold. And those are qualities that I think require a degree of maturity in any society, and that's something that's going to evolve over time, that we need to be conscious of. So I think this is a really important point. I'd like to come to a question from a member of the audience, Mike, who asks, where in Australian law is the recognition that human rights are fundamental rather than derivative from government power? So where in Australian law do we get that idea, that recognition?
That stems from our common law tradition. So you won't find a single point in a statute that you can go to that makes that point explicitly, but it is found throughout our legal tradition. And it's actually really important that it's done in that way, because it sets the scene where freedom is the starting point, and the job of the law is to restrict freedom in limited ways that are accepted by society. If you start from the point that your freedoms are set out in law, then you've inverted the proposition, and you actually start from the point that your freedom isn't complete, that it's only what the law tells you it is. So I actually think it's important to start from that widest possible realm of freedom, as freedom being the starting point, and the law provides acceptable limits to that.
Couldn't agree with that more. It's an excellent answer. And the point in particular around essentially what is a free society is one that defers to the basic concept that people are free, and then the government draws the boundaries of the limit of that freedom, not that we start from a permissive society where your freedom is limited by the extent to which people like me grant you or give you a tick about what it is you can do. Because in practice, that then means that not only government and law has to be very prescriptive and definitive in what it permits, but actually it really means that you never have any real freedom, because it's always both a gift of somebody else which can easily take it away, but also that you constantly have to check the framework or the legislative framework that would enable you to be able to go out very basic functions in society.
I think that's one of the real challenges in terms of actually creating effective human rights law, that you are really trying to define something that's inherent and intangible in many respects.
How do we manage situations where the exercise of different rights clash? We have a question from Rani, who asks how to tackle the situation in which human rights clash with certain communities' religious beliefs. But we can extend it beyond that. We've talked about courage and the political context within which rights are exercised. But how do we manage situations where the exercise of rights brings the holders of rights, as it were, into conflict? Is it through law?
Well, there's no magic answer to that. That's the really core question when it comes to rights. The legal answer is that it's through the prism of proportionality. And so we talk about balancing out different rights and trying to find an accommodation that allows for the greatest realm of freedom possible in relation to both of the conflicting rights, or that finds a compromise that's acceptable to the community. The difficulty with that is it is not a one-size-fits-all approach, that it's really dependent on the particular circumstances, it's dependent on the particular facts. So the answer is proportionality, but how that's applied in practice is a lot more difficult.
And because the other reason is sitting behind that concept of proportionality is context is so often the relevant factor in deciding where that test of proportionality sits. And so whether it's principles of equality or anti-discrimination, or whether it goes through to people's fundamental freedoms, in certain contexts, people can use certain expressions and it would be considered a common vernacular amongst a subset of the rest of the community or a subculture, and it can have a very different meaning when it's expressed in the form of a slur and can amount to harassment. So, and there are plenty of examples of that in human history, whether it's based on people's ethnic origin or whatnot. So context matters enormously about where that test of proportionality is. But one of the things we massively undervalue is the informal mechanisms or structures of our society. Firstly, that law is one part of the answer around test proportionality, but it's not like when you take the law out that all of a sudden the world is anarchic. It's not. In workplaces, people have codes of responsibility or how people are supposed to treat each other in an ethical and responsible manner. Sometimes they're formal, sometimes they're informal, sometimes they germinate in the culture of an organisation over time and then are formalised. But sometimes things shouldn't be in law whatsoever. And I think the problem too often we face in the space around finding that balance between rights is that we think we can design it legislatively, when I don't think a lot of the time we can. I think we have to allow either for a pluralism or a diversity of different options within a society and recognise that we're not all going to agree, and that that's okay not to all agree. And that's, I think, what's been lost in a lot of the conversation around how we conserve rights in Australia.
I think, Tim is right. The legal framework is very important, and we do need to have laws to set out those outer limits and times when certain behaviours need to be prescribed in a particular way for various reasons. But I think the other thing that's missing from this conversation is the law itself should not be the only guide to your behaviour as a human being. It should be a minimal standard, but at the end of the day, just because you can, it doesn't mean you should. And just because the law perhaps might allow you to do something, I think we also need to exercise decency and compassion and human judgment and respect. Civility, absolutely. And recognise that the society we want to live in shouldn't just be what is laid out in law. It actually should be a much more complete picture than that. The law is only one important part.
Yeah, I mean, in his under-celebrated work, Adam Smith wrote in his Theory of Moral Sentiments that, people measure their conduct to want to be held in the good standing of others, but we never seem to value that as a basic proposition. And it's actually true. People don't treat each other appropriately, respectfully, with tolerance, etc., simply because of family bonds or commercial transactions or because of law. There can be many reasons why people engage on a civil basis, because it goes to the heart of, like that old biblical tradition about how one wants to be treated themselves and therefore how we treat others. And that's why culture itself is a very powerful mechanism to be able to promote a society based on rights and tolerance, so long as it's anchored with responsibilities and, of course, a sense of mutual responsibility beyond just the people immediately to you. I think one of the biggest problems we probably have, and now I'm starting to sound like an old conservative, which is something I've always railed against, but actually that's one of the things we've weakened with our culture, because people are asserting the rights piece, but not the responsibilities piece with it.
I think that's right, and it's an interesting point, because I think the problem with law is that it's a one-way ratchet. The more law we have, the more law we feel we need, and it makes me think some of the things that each of you has been saying reminds you of the protracted and heated debate we had some years ago about the repeal of Section 18C of the Racial Discrimination Act. I think there was a real feeling that take 18C out of the equation with those 4 categories of behaviour, and we would have chaos, we would have anarchy, we'd have people at each other's throats. And it was very difficult to move society beyond that point. It was almost as if we absolutely had to have that piece of legislation in place to stop uncivil behaviour erupting. And I think that was to miss the point of what actually is required of us as citizens. So I think that's a really important thing you say.
Well, I think that's right. And I think, and I mean, I was a veteran of those battles, shall we say, in terms of the conversation. And, and I learned a lot throughout that conversation. But I also, it goes to that point again about, whether people see consistency between their rights and their responsibilities and how they translate to others. I had it was 18C has a lot of support in the Jewish community, as you're probably aware, or at least you might be aware, and Lorraine might be aware. Some audience members may not, and obviously to do with traditions around anti-Semitism that they, quite justifiably want to combat. And I remember having this discussion with this rabbi about, I understand why you feel very strongly about the design of 18C, but what if I were to introduce, and this was obviously showing the time, we had an equivalent provision where it became unlawful to offend somebody on the basis of sexual orientation, as existed at the time in Tasmania. And I said, you would no longer be able to confidently preach that you believe that marriage was an institution ordained by God between a man and a woman without potentially offending somebody and finding violation with the law. And frankly, the scariest thing was that they hadn't really thought about it. Rather than it being a positive or a negative thing, it prompted them to reconsider their perspective about where the test in law should be and how it should apply.
Well, Lorraine, I wonder if I can bring the conversation, change direction and bring it to one of the most pressing international issues that we face at the moment, which, of course, is the desperate situation in Ukraine. We've had some questions about this earlier on in the webinar. Russia's invasion is throwing up questions about refugees, about the violation of state sovereignty, about the threat to what's called the rules-based international orders. What implications, and this is a big question, I realize, but what implications does the invasion have for the protection of human rights?
In my view, it has really significant implications. And I guess the first point to make is it's just heartbreaking seeing those images coming out of Ukraine, because of course we know that in any war, it's innocent civilians who suffer the most. And we are seeing reports of civilians being killed, civilians being injured, residential areas being subject to attack. And it really is shocking to see that able to happen in this day and age. So in terms of the overall international response, I think it is really important for the world to be united in this moment and to send a very clear, not only message, but through action to show that this cannot stand. In terms of the implications for human rights, I think the real concern is this is such a foundational breach of the rules-based international system. The idea that a country can unilaterally and in a completely unjustified way invade another country, another sovereign state, is an absolute foundational breach of the international system as it's been set up since World War II, effectively. And from Australia's perspective, we're a medium nation in terms of the world. So we revert back to a situation where might is right and big countries can decide to do whatever they want without regard to foundational rules. Suddenly our situation becomes a lot more precarious. And from a human rights perspective, again, the foundation of human rights in the modern world is that rules-based international system. So if that system starts to be challenged, then really the foundation of human rights in the modern era is itself being challenged as well.
With so many people being displaced, I think the UN is reporting that up to 1 million people have been displaced within Ukraine, and something like 700,000 people have fled to neighboring countries such as Poland, Romania, and Hungary, and Moldova. How well placed do you think the human rights protections for refugees are?
Well, I think it demonstrates the enormity of the issues that we're facing in the world, because those numbers are enormous. And I think there does need to be a concerted international effort to make sure that immediate humanitarian support is provided. And as the situation develops, that longer term options are on the table to ensure that the human cost of the war is minimised as much as possible. It's just a devastating situation. And again, it really shows the fact that we can have all of the human rights instruments in the world, we can have all of the best laws in the world, all of the best structures, but at the end of the day, it comes down to actions. And if a state can simply invade another state and inflict this type of horror on people, it really does call into question the foundations of human rights in the world.
As you'll know, one of the criticisms that's been made of Western countries is that their lack of preparedness. And even today, President Biden yesterday, the President Biden in the State of the Union address declared that the West was ready. And critics immediately pounced on that and said that if the West had been ready, this might not have happened. So I don't want to get into the politics of the State of the Union address, but I raise this because it seems to me that, in fact, what's happening in Ukraine and the fact that it will touch the lives of Australians who have strong connections with Ukraine is that it's a reminder to us of some of the fundamental principles by which we claim to live our lives but perhaps have taken for granted. Do you think that Ukraine will serve in a way as a wake-up call to us all about the need to be vigilant about the rights that are observed overseas, but also the way in which we think about rights here? And it will change the way we think about the conception of human rights as they operate in Australia.
It's a really interesting point, because I think in many respects here in Australia, the vast majority of us take rights for granted. And that's one of the interesting things about the pandemic is that I think for the first time, many Australians who day to day, and this isn't all Australians, but many Australians day to day don't have to really think about human rights. And for the first time, perhaps in terms of the pandemic restrictions, they've had a very tangible reminder of the fact that rights are inherent, but they're not inevitable. And I think at an international level, this is what we're seeing again, because we need to recognise that this idea of universal human rights being respected internationally is actually a revolutionary idea. And again, the idea of democracy and freedom, that's a relatively new concept in terms of the international framework being set up to support those types of systems. So I think we need to remember that these things need constant renewal. They need constant strengthening. And I think from a strategic perspective, we need to be very realistic about the fact that there are many, many countries in the world that take a very different approach to human rights than perhaps we do. And that certainly around the world, there's been a growing trend in recent years of democratic backsliding. And I think that's something from a human rights perspective that we do need to be very aware of, because we need to ensure that rights and freedoms are defended by countries and individuals who have a shared belief in their intrinsic value. And I don't think we can take for granted that everybody shares that view.
Is there a clash or a potential clash between this idea of the universal recognition of rights and the claims that a sovereign state makes to be able to order its own affairs? And the argument is made that we need to respect the sovereignty of states, but then when we see the sovereignty of other states being breached, we make universal assumptions. In other words, isn't there a conflict between making statements that we think have universal application and recognising the autonomy of a sovereign state?
Well, that's one of the tensions in terms of, the international conception of human rights. How do you strike that balance between recognising the underlying universality of human rights, but also recognising that in different places there may be different ways that those rights are realised, and there are, again, acceptable differences in terms of how some of those things are done. But I think surely if we can find common ground on anything, it's the fact that civilians shouldn't be bombed when they're sitting in their homes. You know, there are certain minimum human rights that, you know, are set out in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that were agreed upon by nations who were coming together at the end of the war to think about the type of world we wanted to create. And within those rights, there is room for state sovereignty to be recognised, for there to be differences in application. But the real heart of those rights, in terms of a core right to life, etc., I think is undeniable, and that's what we need to be defending.
I think that's right, and surely, I mean, because the most recent articulation of human rights flowed from the end of the Second World War. But one of the other things that happened at the end of the Second World War was that I think the international order became much clearer about defining war crimes. And although there had always been notions of the way which war needed to be conducted, emerging mainly during the 18th and 19th centuries, I think in the 20th century we saw the emergence of a much clearer international consensus about how war, given its inevitability in human life, nonetheless needs to be conducted. So we do have a number of universal assumptions that we make, and in fact universal standards that we say have to be met.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that that's actually one of the very that human rights framework, again, is something that we all have tended to take for granted. You know, I've never known anything else in the world. But if you look at the full stretch of human history, we're living in a time that's certainly the exception rather than the rule in terms of having that core belief in the importance of human rights and the importance of security and stability. And I think that is something that's really important. But again, I also think that what the current situation in Ukraine has shown us is that those understood conceptions that are shared, those broad frameworks, unless they're matched with action, they actually don't mean very much. So, you know, watching those scenes unfold in Ukraine, it's just heartbreaking to see them and to know that there are human rights frameworks and treaties that shouldn't allow this to happen, but it is happening. And I think we do need to unite to say that it's unacceptable. There is simply no justification for what is happening there at the moment.
And you're optimistic then, I think, that these sorts of actions and these changes of behaviour can come about and can be promoted. You're optimistic about the future of human rights?
I'm always optimistic. I think there are a lot of challenges, and I think you need to be realistic about the challenges that we're facing. And I certainly think we're at a period of time where the strategic situation internationally has changed markedly in recent years, and that nations such as ours are facing significant challenges in terms of defending rights and freedoms and defending democracy. But again, I think it's really important that we have these types of conversations to remind ourselves why these things are important, and hopefully to strengthen our willingness to make sure that we do defend human rights and continue to renew them. Because again, you know, unless they're constantly renewed, these ideas aren't inevitable. So we need to constantly be explaining why they're important, talking about why they're important, and making sure that in our actions, we show why they're important. And I think the final point on that front is, you know, I'm very realistic about the fact that when it comes to human rights, no country's perfect, no system is perfect. But certainly I think we've seen in recent times a flourishing of human rights in a way that is unparalleled in human history. And while we can always do better, we shouldn't fail to recognise that these things are important and that we have done a lot to progress human rights over the past few generations.
That's an optimistic and realistic note on which to end. Lorraine Finlay, many thanks for being my guest on this webinar this evening about the future of human rights in Australia, and to the Honourable Tim Wilson MP as well. Thank you both very much indeed.
Thank you so much.
Well, for decades, the CIS has been a fiercely independent voice working hard to promote sound classical liberal principles. To be notified of our future videos, make sure you subscribe to our channel, then click the notification bell. We rely solely on the generosity of people like you for donations to advance our classical liberal cause. Check out the links on screen now to see how you can get involved.